أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. In the previous course we were discussing the Hadith Al-Mutawatir, which is the successive Hadith. To recap, what is the Hadith Al-Mutawatir? It's a report that has been narrated by such a high number of narrators in each group, in each link, such that you feel certain, beyond any doubt, that the report must be true and it's not something that was fabricated. So for instance, let's say you are told that an event occurred 200 years ago. You are told that your great-great-grandfather, on his deathbed, he said this will. Just as an example. Now today, you are hearing this from 100 people. 100 people from your extended large family are saying that our great-great-grandfather 2 centuries ago, he made this will. Now when you look at these 100 people, to know if this is mutawatir or not, ask yourself this question. 100 people is a lot, obviously. So you have a high number there. First of all, ask yourself, did these 100 people get together and conspire? Or no, this happened spontaneously. One of your relatives in Germany is narrating this, another one in Brazil, another one in Iran, another one in Canada. And let's say you don't have this social media like WhatsApp, because once you have this social media, they could probably have collaborated with each other. Well, let's say in the past, before the age of the internet. So you're saying, okay, I'm hearing this from 100 people. And it's not really possible for them to have just gathered and made this up. Just because of how, of their geography, of where they live. Some of them may not even know each other. You don't know all of your relatives, right? There are some very distant 4th, 5th, 6th cousins. You don't know them. So when you look at all these factors, you're like, I'm pretty confident that they did not conspire. It's not like they live in the same village, in the same area where they could have a motive to conspire. That's the first question you ask. The second question, okay, these relatives who are narrating this, obviously they did not personally hear this from my great-great-grandfather because they were not alive at that time. Who did they hear it from? So these 100 people, you do research, you discover that they heard it from, let's say, 70 people. 70 of the older relatives who passed away, let's say, in the previous decades. So now you still have a significant number, 80 people who've narrated this. And upon your research, you also see that it's very, very unlikely, nearly impossible for them to have conspired. Now, this is the second group. The first group are those who directly narrate it to you. The second group are those whom they narrated it from. Then we say, okay, they also didn't live at the time of your great-great-grandfather. They must have narrated it from a previous generation. How many people did they narrate it from? You go and you do research, you ask them, who did you narrate it from? Okay, from my father. Your father, who did he narrate this from? From so-and-so person, his father, your grandfather, let's say. And then once you gather the numbers, you see that it's 40 people. 40 people who were witnesses when that great-grandfather made his will at his deathbed. 40 were present there. And they are attesting that we heard this directly from him. And you also have no reason to suspect that, they were collaborating. So, if this is the case, then this is mutawatir. you have certainty beyond any doubt that my grandfather did actually say that will, and you act upon it. Now, if you realize that the 100 people whom you heard it from narrated it from 80, but those 80 narrated it from 2 only, from 2 of his sons who were supposedly there at his deathbed. Is that tawatur? No. Because now in that earliest group you only have 2. Even though 80 heard it from those 2, but at the end of the day it goes down to 2 people. And with 2 people you don't have what's called tawatur. They could still be reliable, and if they're reliable you can take their word for it. But it's not tawatur, a successive chain for a report such that it makes it absolutely true. So that's just to recap tawatur, what tawatur means. Now, in the group we gave the example of the crucifixion of Prophet Jesus alayhi salam, or let's say his, rising 3 days after. If someone were to tell you, okay, so many people have narrated this in history, such that this is an example of a successive hadith, there's no doubt that it must have happened. How do we respond to that? So the important question to ask is to go to those earliest sources, those who witnessed Prophet Jesus ﷺ supposedly being crucified, or those who witnessed him rise from his grave. Do your historical research and see how many people actually witnessed that. How many solid, reliable reports do we have that the people at his time actually witnessed such events? Was it 1 person, 2 people? Was it hearsay? Is it Paul just claiming this, for example, and some other writers of the Bible? If your only source are the words of Paul and Mark, Matthew, John, those who wrote these Gospels, that's not tawatur. Because Paul, who's he narrating it from? What are his sources? Was there such a significant number of people who witnessed it that it gives you yaqeen, absolute certainty, or no? So when you do your historical research, for example, did Jesus rise from his grave 3 days later? Upon closer examination, you realize there aren't many first-hand witnesses who actually witnessed. Some of these later Gospels will tell you, yeah, so-and-so woman, she saw that. So-and-so woman, she witnessed it. Who is she? What's your link to her? How many other people actually witnessed this? There's no tawatur here. There is not a high number of people who directly witnessed the event. And that breaks the tawatur. Now, just because you don't have tawatur doesn't automatically mean it's invalid. It just means we don't have certainty. We just have to look for other clues to see if an event like that happened or not. Now, with the crucifixion of Prophet Isa alayhi salam, there is a strong indication that he was crucified. Because the Quran tells us, وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. It appeared to them as if he were crucified, because the one who betrayed Prophet Isa alayhi salam, he went to tell the enemies of where Jesus was. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him resemble Jesus. So that's why they captured him. Once they captured him, then they crucified him. So there are some indications someone was crucified. However, for us to know that Jesus himself was crucified, how many witnesses are there? How many of his close disciples who know him, who were with him, witnessed that he was actually crucified? We don't have a high number that will constitute tawatur for us. There are some witnesses here and there. There are some claims, but it's not to the point where you can say this is mutawatir. So this is just to recap what tawatur is. It's any report that such a high number of people have narrated, such that you have certainty that it did happen. Now if we open the book to page 20, under the heading, Another Classification, the author describes to us briefly what tawatur is. So number 4, another classification under the heading number 4. If you have a different edition, you will find it in the very first chapter, the introduction, under the heading number 4. Another classification. So a report invariably fits into either of 2 categories, regardless of whether it is known to be true or not. Whether you know it to be true or not, you have 2 types of reports. The first is called the Mutawatir. The Mutawatir is a report that has so many narrators that it is conventionally impossible for them all to have agreed upon its fabrication. It's just impossible, you know. When you examine that these were random people who all witnessed this event, they did not really conspire, they had no interest in doing so, so you are certain that they didn't conspire. This multitude, this high number, must be fulfilled on all the levels or generations of reporters. This is something we described last week, you know, where you have several groups of narrators. This multitude, this high number must be fulfilled in each group. If one of the groups has only 1, 2, or 3 narrators, that breaks the tawatur. So let's say you have tawatur up until the first generation. When you look at the sources in the first generation, you say, oh, it's only 3 people who supposedly saw the event. That's no longer tawatur. That would break the tawatur. So the author says, on all the levels or generations of reporters, in such a way that the beginning of the chain is pretty much the same as its end, and the middle of the chain is congruous with the 2 ends, meaning they all have that multitude. Let's say if we consider that high number to be 20, well, we don't specify a number, but let's say it's 20, then all generations satisfy that number. In the beginning of the chain, you have 20 narrators, then another 20 narrated it, then another 20, then it reached you from those 20. That's a tawatur. Is that clear in the book? Okay. So the number of reporters has not been stipulated. There are other schools of thought, some of the Sunni schools of thought, who say there is a number that will give you tawatur. Some say 5, some 7, some 10, some 15. There are different opinions. We, the Shia school of thought, we say there is no fixed number. It just depends on the case that you're dealing with. Some cases may demand a higher number for it to constitute a tawatur. Some cases, no, it could be a lower number. But it has to be a significant number. You know, it has to be at least 15, 20. We're talking about a bigger number. So 5, 7, 10 is not really tawatur. 15 and up, yes, that probably constitutes tawatur. So the number of reporters has not been stipulated or restricted to an exact figure. We don't have an exact figure. As some people believe, who is he referring to? Other schools of thought who believe that, no, you could establish a number. But rather it serves to generate certitude. See, that's key here. When you give it to the average person, that number will give you certitude. So if you ask your society about a certain event, and you tell them how many people should narrate this for the average person just to feel certain that it must have happened. So this could vary from one society to another, from one case to another case. But you just take the average. The point is to get certainty. If 15 is giving you certainty, that's fine. If 25 is required to give you certainty, then that's what gives you tawatur. Now, in order for a hadith to give you certainty, a hadith mutawatir, to give you certainty, 3 conditions must be observed. What are these conditions? So it generates certitude if it fulfills all the following conditions. Let's examine these conditions. Number 1, this one is just really a technical condition. The first condition for any hadith to give you certainty is that you should be unaware of the contents of the hadith, and you should not have prior knowledge. Why? Because if you have prior knowledge and you know about the hadith, then it's not going to give you certainty because you already have certainty, right? Like I said, this is just technical. You know, if you already know someone died, you already know, and someone comes with strong evidence and tells you, you know what, someone died. Did that add anything to you? No. You're like, okay, I already knew that. So this did not give me any new certainty. So this is just technical. So the first condition is that the listener be previously unaware of the content of the report that he is hearing. For if he were, it would be tautological. In Arabic, we call this tahsil hasil. What it means is that it's redundant. You already know it. It's not giving you any certainty. You know, in the science of logic, we do have such technical conditions. You can say that this hadith gave me certainty because I did not have certainty before. Then you got that certainty. So a hadith will give you certainty, first of all, if you are not aware of its contents. Then it gives you certainty. So that's obvious. It's a technical condition. Here's the second very important condition. There are many mutawatir reports in the world, but not everyone believes in them. Why? Because of this second condition. The second condition says that the listener's mind be free of any suspicion about the report that may cause him to reject the multiple and successive nature of it. If someone has pre-assumptions about something, someone is skeptical, someone is suspicious about a report, an event, they've been, let's say, brainwashed to not accept that event. Even if you bring this person a hadith that is mutawatir, they might still reject it. Let me give you some examples. Let's say someone here is told, look, this Prophet of Islam, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, is a fake figure. He never existed. These Arabs made him up for their political agenda. Let's say someone grows up in a village or a society or watching some media that tells you that casts this doubt, right? Now, you're trying to prove to this person through tawatur, no, the Prophet did exist. There was a man in 7th century Arabia who did bring a new religion. And you show him the proofs. And you tell him, look, it's impossible for something like that to have been fabricated, because in every generation, so many reporters narrated that, it's impossible for them to have conspired. Now, even if you're telling him that, he may still reject. Why? Because before he already has an assumption that this figure did not exist. It's a fake historical figure, people made him up. And the book that he brought, it was made up. He didn't know man in 7th century Arabia, his name was Mohammad, who gave a book like that, who produced a book like that. This person, obviously, even if you give him mutawatir reports, he's not going to, he possibly may not accept them. Why? Because he already is suspicious about this. Or if you bring some of the miracles of the Prophet, like splitting of the moon, even if you show someone mutawatir reports, that person may still not have certainty. Why? Because they're already suspicious about this. They've already taken a stance. And obviously for such people, it may not give full certainty. Yes?
For example, Fakhruddin al-Razi, who had already seen the ahadith, like the mutawatir ahadith.
That's a very good example.
But did not accept it because he had this.
Exactly. So as we mentioned, Fakhruddin al-Razi, the famous Sunni scholar and exegete of the Quran, mufassir of the Quran, he admits that I have come across 400 paths to the hadith or event of Ghadir. Right? He admits 400. Now in his school of thought, 10 is enough to give you tawatur. But he says, but I still feel uneasy about it. There's still something about it. Why is it not giving him that full yaqeen? Because he already has this preconceived notion that, you know what, Imam Ali is not the direct successor of the Prophet. So even if there's a hadith that's mutawatir, he may not accept it. Because he's just suspicious about the event. He doesn't like it. That's a very good example. He admits that there are 400 paths. And according to his school of thought, you only need 10. But why does he reject it? Because of this second condition is not met. He's not getting certainty because he's already suspicious of the event. He already has a stance. And when people have a stance, they're just not willing to see the truth. So if you give a hadith mutawatir to someone who's objective, someone who's just an observer, has no stance, has no suspicions, they're being objective, a hadith mutawatir should generate certainty. So that's the second condition. Number 3, the third condition is that the reporter's narration, that first generation who narrated it, be based on personal perception rather than presumption and logical deduction. In Arabic, we have two terms you will constantly hear in fiqh, Islamic law, science of hadith, science of men and biographies. We have what is called his and hats. His and hats. What is the meaning of these two words? They're very similar. His literally, linguistically means your senses. And hats means the conclusions that you draw, the deduction that you make, the analysis that you make. This is called hats. His and hats. His, we can translate it into perception. And hats, we can translate it into analysis. That first generation who's narrating that incident, that they saw this event, for you to have tawatur that gives you certainty, they should be narrating the event through perception, meaning they saw with their own senses, they saw that event. They heard the person narrate that event. They heard the Prophet. They heard the Imam. Right? So they're not inserting their own opinions, analysis, ideas. No. It was direct perception. That's a hadith we can accept. Because a narrator, I'm using him as a messenger only. He's just conveying to me what he heard from the Prophet or the Imams. I don't want his opinion. Because his opinion is not hujjah on me, it's not proof for me. I want to make my own conclusion about this. What others are drawing, the conclusions they're drawing, that's not binding for me. They could have misunderstood the Prophet's statement. They could have arrived at different conclusions because they may have had different schools of thought, different criteria for how they use logic. So for a hadith to be authentic and binding for you and to give it certainty, it should be based on perception. I heard the Prophet say these words. They're not giving you an analysis of what the Prophet did or what the Imam said. If they're giving you their own opinion and analysis, what do we call it? Hats. In Arabic, we call that hats. That hat is not really binding for us. Now, where does this become very important? This becomes highly critical in the science of biographies. Let's say we want to know if Zurara is a reliable companion, right? Was he a reliable narrator or not? So how do you know? You have to go and read about him, about those who talked about him and who witnessed for him or against him. Now let's say you come to Najashi. We've talked about Najashi before. He's one of the most important scholars in the science of biographies. He evaluates the narrators for us. So let's say you open the book of Najashi and Najashi says Zurara was reliable. When Najashi says Zurara was reliable, is that through perception or through analysis? Is he making his own conclusions that Zurara was reliable, or no, he's basing this on perception, on actual facts? Because this is very important. Sometimes when you're evaluating a person, you are basing it on reality. You're like, look, I saw this person do this, do that, commit this sin, commit that sin. You saw it. You heard it. That's perception. I can take your word for it. But sometimes you could be drawing conclusions. You could say, you know what? This person has weird beliefs and ideas. And you don't agree with their ideas. So you're like, you know what? They're not trustworthy. Now when you investigate why, did you deliberately see him lying? No. Then why are you saying he's not trustworthy? Well, because he's got these wrong beliefs. He's, his beliefs are corrupt. And so someone whose beliefs are corrupt, I don't consider trustworthy. See, now that's what? Analysis and hats. Hats is not binding on me. Maybe if I were to look at the evidence myself, I could come to a different conclusion. So only hiss is what's acceptable to us. Hats, not really. So that's why sometimes when you're reading the statement of these scholars like Najashi and evaluating the companions of the Imams, you have to read what exactly are they saying. Are they just giving us their ideas and conclusions, or no? They're just basing it on research, that this person was truthful for these reasons. They're not imposing their own opinions. Because sometimes that would happen. You would see, for example, Najashi would say, so-and-so narrator is not reliable. He's a liar. Why? Because he was deviant. See, when he tells you that I am considering him to be a liar because he's a deviant, is that perception or that's analysis? What do you say? It's analysis, right? Because he's telling you pretty much why. He's like, this person is a liar because he's deviant. That's analysis. That's not solid proof that he was a liar. He may have been truthful, but because of his wrong beliefs, he was accused of being not reliable. So, in order for a report to give you that certainty, these three conditions should be met. Yes, brother?
I wanted to take it back a little. You know how you said that there must be like more than, like you said 20, for example.
As an example,
Let's
right.
say there was 3, but they're considered reliable. Like, if we look in the book of Najashi, he says that all these 3 are reliable. Could we take it as a...
We can take that. I mentioned that. Let's say you only have 3 who are reliable, or even 1.
Yeah.
But Najashi says he's reliable, and based on your research, it seems that he was reliable. You can take that hadith, but it's no longer called mutawatir.
Okay.
It's still acceptable. But does it generate certainty for you? Yaqeen? No. It doesn't generate certainty. But is it enough proof? Yes, it's enough proof. You can rely on it. But there's a chance he may have made a mistake. There's a chance he may have lied. There's a small chance, right? It's a small chance, but the chance still does exist. With a mutawatir report, there is no chance that they lied or made a mistake. Okay, one person can make a mistake, not 50, not 100, if it was all based on perception. Or let's say, when the month of Ramadan comes and people are out in the open field, in the open witnessing for the crescent, right? Now, one person can make a mistake, maybe it was a stray of cloud or I don't know what it was and they thought it was the moon. That's possible. But if you have 200 people out there and they're witnessing and they all confirmed, we saw the crescent, would you doubt them? No, you wouldn't doubt them. You're like, okay, one person can make a mistake. Maybe it was haze. Maybe his eyes weren't seeing well, right? But 50 people, 100 people, no. Come on, 100 people who saw the moon, randomly saw the moon. It's not like they went and conspired, let's say each one from his location. That gives you yaqeen, okay, the moon was visible tonight. So we can accept the report of a reliable person. We'll talk about that later. But it's not called mutawatir. Right now we're just classifying. Mutawatir is a hadith that just gives you certainty. You don't even need to go and investigate who the narrators were. Were they truthful? Were they not? Were they pious? It doesn't matter. Because the number is so high, it gives you certainty it must have happened. It's impossible for all these people just to, conspire and make up this event. So that is still an accepted hadith, but it falls under another category.
So the main difference between mutawatir and khabar wahid is mutawatir, we're certain that this happened.
We are certain, yeah.
Khabar wahid, we're not.
You have confidence, but it's not full confidence. Now, what is one fruit to this, classification? If you have a contradiction between the khabar al-mutawatir and the khabar al-thiqa, the reliable one. Let's say, these 400 people, as Fakhr al-Razi says, they witnessed that Ghadir did happen. So that's a khabar mutawatir. Then you go and find 2 hadiths in some book that say no, this was fabricated, it didn't happen. The Prophet didn't say these words. Now you have a contradiction, right? When you have a contradiction between something's mutawatir and something that's not mutawatir, which one will you give preference to? The mutawatir. See, that's one fruit to this discussion here.
So could we say that mutawatir ahadith are always true?
Pretty much yes. Mutawatir hadiths give you yaqeen and certainty that they are true. Now there's a very small chance, 1 in 10,000, that they could be false. That's why the author says in describing the hadith, he says it is conventionally impossible. He didn't say logically impossible. Generally speaking, how our society runs and works, it just gives you yaqeen that, look, it's impossible. Normally it's impossible for them to have made this up. But is it a logical impossibility? No. There is no logical impossibility here. There is, 1 in 100,000 chance that they could have all erred. It's not impossible. The chance is very small, but it's not impossible logically. So you could have a mutawatir hadith that is false, but that is very, very, very unlikely. The chances are so low, it's negligible. That, no intellectual person will pay attention to that. Yes, sister.
These mutawatir hadith, they're already established.
Yes, they already happened in history, right.
Labeled, or they're from certain books that say mutawatir?
Well, in the books of hadith, when scholars discuss hadiths, they will say if this is mutawatir or not. There are some disagreements as to which hadith is mutawatir or not. Those who say, my definition of mutawatir is if you have only 7 narrators, for them that's mutawatir. But let's say, for me, 7 is not enough. I need 15, let's say. So yes, this is discussed in the books of hadith and in Islamic law, whether this hadith is mutawatir or not. Now, the author will discuss, do we have mutawatir hadiths or no in Islamic law? So in the following page, the next page, the author says, multiple successive transmission, which is tawatur, that's the meaning of tawatur. In wording, the exact same wording has been narrated, is often achieved in fundamental legal rulings. What is fundamental legal rulings? The actual obligation that we have in Islam. For example, prayer is mandatory. Prayer is mandatory. That is something we have yaqeen on. Certainty beyond any doubt. Because so many narrators throughout history have told us that Islam, the Quran, the Prophet made prayer an obligation. The actual Hajj, that is something we have tawatur on. Fasting. So when you look at the principles of these obligations, the origin of them, we have tawatur on. Something no Muslim can come and say, you know what, prayer is not wajib. You're defying the tawatur if you do say that. It's impossible for those people to have just made this up. So when it comes to the fundamental legal rulings, such as the obligatory nature of the daily prayers, that they're obligatory, that they're not recommended. You know, if someone comes to, look, Salat al-Subuh is recommended. What would you say to them? What would your response be? It's like, no, it's recommended. People think it's obligation. What would you say?
It's wajib.
Okay, it's wajib, but what's your proof that it's wajib? The easiest proof is tawatur. It's like generation after generation, from now back to the Prophet, every generation, so many people narrated that it's wajib. It's mandatory, it's not a recommendation.
So the salah is not proved by the Quran?
The Quran talks about the salah. But first of all, maybe the Quran is just recommending it to us. Someone could dispute that. The Quran has moral recommendations and it's saying salah is good for you. Okay? Let's say someone comes up with this argument. Or another argument today you will find it is hijab, right? Some will tell you hijab is not explicitly mentioned in the Quran and they'll try to understand the verses differently. One of our proofs is tawatur. Every generation that came after the Prophet have narrated that in Islam, hijab was wajib. Was not something that the Prophet said, you know, it's optional. You like to do it, you don't. No, the Prophet said, it's a requirement. God wants you to do it. That's another example. So one way to prove hijab is through tawatur. It's not like one narrator mentioned it and we're basing all of this on one person. No. So many companions during the time of the Prophet told the later generation that hijab was wajib, and they told the later generation until it reached us. So if someone comes and takes the ayah of hijab and disputes that it is wajib, you know, some people will tell you, the Quran is talking about modesty and it's just a recommendation to be modest. It doesn't actually mean you have to cover your hair. So if someone disputes that, another way to prove it is through tawatur. That we see generation after generation after generation, it was clear to them that hijab was wajib. So that proves hijab is wajib, is mandatory. So, such as the obligatory nature of the daily prayers, the number of units in them. Does the Quran say that the Maghrib prayer is 3 units? It doesn't say that. How do we know it's 3 units? Do you have any doubts about it, or you're certain it's 3 rak'ahs? How do you have that certainty? You guys didn't go and research the hadith books, did you? You didn't, right? How do you have that certainty?
Everyone does it. Every generation.
See, you reworded tawatur in a very simple way by saying everyone does it. When you see every Muslim from one generation to the after, and then when you go and read history books, you realize that in Medina, in Kufa, and everywhere, from the time of the Prophet until our time, people used to pray Salat al-Maghrib 3 rak'ahs. That's tawatur. That gives you yaqeen and certainty that this is how it was. Because so many narrators in every generation narrated it. So the units in them, fasting, the actual fasting, Hajj, the pilgrimage, that Hajj is wajib, and that Hajj is to Mecca, right? Not to some other city. That's tawatur. There's no doubt about that. Now, when it comes to the details of these obligations, we don't have tawatur. That's why the author says it is seldom, very rarely achieved, meaning the tawatur is achieved in traditions of a specific nature. For example, the hadith that says, if you have shak, doubts, between the 3rd and the 4th rak'ah, what do you do? Okay, it's a reliable hadith, but is it mutawatir? such that so many narrators in every generation narrated it? No. You don't have tawatur. When it comes to the specifics of salah, we have reliable narrations and we can rely on them. But do we have mutawatir hadiths? No, we don't. So the author says it is seldom achieved in traditions of a specific nature. Although their meanings may have come down in multiple successive transmission. He says it's very rare to find a hadith about a specific aspect of salah, that so many narrators narrated that the Prophet said these exact words. Maybe we can't find that, but the meanings of them could be mutawatir, even if there's no particular hadith that we're referring to, but some things are just known by Muslims, even if there's no particular hadith about them. Some details are also so clear that is just known. Now, if you want to give an example of a hadith that's mutawatir, most scholars in history, especially the Sunni scholars, they have mentioned this hadith. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. What does that mean? Your actions are based on your intentions. So the author says in the following paragraph, the tradition, all actions will be judged according to one's intention. That's another translation. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. Is this a mutawatir hadith? Some schools of thought have claimed, when asked about an example of a mutawatir hadith, they mention this as an example, that the Prophet says, you'll be judged according to your intention, not necessarily your action. And your action is based on your intention. What did you intend when you did this act? So they've said this is a mutawatir hadith. It's so widely reported and circulated that it's a mutawatir hadith. The author doesn't accept that. The author says is not technically mutawatir. This hadith is not mutawatir. Even though at present, in our times, the number of people who have transmitted it exceed by several times the number required for it to be considered mutawatir. If you open today hadith books, you'll find hundreds of people who've narrated this in our time. This scholar narrates it in this hadith, this person narrates it in his book. So at the present, there are many people who narrate this hadith, but the earliest sources, how many were they? So that's why the author says, the reason for this is that multiple successive transmission in this particular hadith that we talked about, the tradition, started in the middle of the chain. So those who directly heard it from the Prophet, it's not such a big number. Later on, this hadith became widely circulated in the middle of the chain. Maybe 100 years after the Prophet. That's when it was flourishing, or 200 years after the Prophet. So this hadith, even though we accept it, it may have a reliable source, but is it mutawatir? The author says no, I don't consider this hadith to be mutawatir. Because when did this high number of narrators emerge? Not from the beginning, but from the middle of the chain. Started in the middle of the chain and continued until the present era. Whereas the condition of congruity and multitude must be fulfilled on all the levels, as we mentioned. Even the first generation who directly heard it from the Prophet, it must have been a very high number. So this hadith is not really an example of a mutawatir hadith, even though it's an accepted hadith, but it's just not technically mutawatir. So we've talked about the khabar al-mutawatir, and basically khabar al-mutawatir is any report that has been so widely narrated at all levels such that it gives you certainty. On the other hand, what do you have? Any report that is not mutawatir, what do we call it? Khabar wahid. You'll hear this very frequently in fiqh, in Islamic law, in the science of hadith. You'll hear about khabar al-wahid. Al-Khabar Al-Wahid. Literally, it means solitary report. Now, it doesn't have to be one for you to call it a solitary report. It's just any hadith that does not fulfill the conditions of mutawatir, we call it a solitary report. It could be 5, it could be 7, it could be even 10. If it's not mutawatir, what do we call it in the science of hadith? We call it khabar wahid. We call it a solitary report. So let's talk about the solitary report a little bit. The khabar al-wahid, solitary report, is the report that does not attain multiple successive transmission. In other words, it does not achieve the status of being mutawatir. And it's divided into 5. We have 5 types of khabar al-wahid. Let's write these types so we can be familiar with them. What is the first type? The first type is what is called the mustafid. I'll write it in Arabic because you have the translation and also the transliteration. Al-mustafid. Al-khabar al-mustafid is a report that has been narrated by a decent number of people. At least 3. At least 3 people have narrated it. Now, if you only have 3 narrators, is that tawatur? No, that's obviously not tawatur. So what do we call it? Mustafid. And whenever a khabar, a report is mustafid, that's a strong indication, a strong clue that it's authentic, right? Because you have several people who've narrated it. You're not just basing it on one single person. That's al-khabar al-mustafid. Number 2, you have al-gharib. What does al-gharib mean? Strange. In the science of hadith, when you hear a strange report, or it's also translated as a rare report, what does that mean? A strange or rare report is the report which has been narrated by one narrator only. We call this a rare report because it's only been narrated by one. Now, does that automatically mean that it's not accepted? No. But it's kind of a clue, you know, how come only one person narrated this? Why not another narrator? Why didn't another person hear the Prophet say this? So it does cast a shadow of doubt, and you have to look for more clues to see if this hadith is authentic or not. So any hadith that's narrated just by one person in our history, we call it a rare report, a strange report. It still could be accepted if it meets certain conditions. What else do we have? We have what is called the maqbool. What's the maqbool? The accepted. What does that mean? We have some hadiths in Islamic law where when you examine the chain of narrators, you will find that it doesn't even have a chain. It's not even clear what the source is. Or one of the narrators of it is known to be not reliable, is known to be a liar. But you see all the scholars, since the time of Shaykh al-Kulayni, Tusi, Saduq, all of those scholars accepted the hadith and they issued their fatwas based on it. What does that indicate? Okay, Shaykh al-Tusi knows this narrator is not trustworthy, yet he issued a fatwa based on that hadith. As Shaykh al-Tusi did the same thing. You see, you know what? There's like a consensus amongst the scholars that this hadith is acceptable. We call this hadith maqbool. Scholars have accepted it, those early scholars, but when you look at the chain of narrators, it's not a sahih chain. It's not an authentic chain of narrators. Now, such a hadith, do we accept it to be reliable? Yes. Why? Because we're saying, look, those early scholars who were experts, they must have had strong proofs and clues that this hadith was correct. They must have had. Because all these scholars just, agreeing that this hadith is correct and actually issuing fatwas, when they were so careful, when they were so pious, this gives you an indication that what? This is an accepted hadith. It's a valid hadith. If you go to any scientific community, if you go to doctors, biologists, psychologists, and you see that in that particular community, the experts just accept this fact, right? You don't know what the source of this fact is. How did they reach that conclusion? You don't know. But you're like, look, as long as I'm seeing all these doctors who are experts, they're accepting this, I'm going to accept it either. Because it's not really possible for all these doctors to have based, something so critical and important on a false allegation. Okay, one person could do that. Two people could do that. But all of these experts basing that on a false allegation, that's very unlikely, right? So that's a maqbool hadith. And we have examples in Islamic law where you look at a hadith, you go to its source, oh, the narrator of this hadith is not reliable. Should I automatically cross it out? No. You'll find all the scholars have accepted this hadith. So those early scholars, remember, they had more books than we have today. They had more sources than we have today. Many more sources. A lot of it got lost in history. So they must have had something 1,000 years ago that made them accept this hadith, but today it's lost. Many books got lost in history. So I'll just trust the judgment of Shaykh al-Tusi, Saduq, and all of them combined. Because I know for a fact that 1,000 years ago there were sources that don't exist today. And so they obviously must have had some proof, some very powerful evidence. So this is the maqbool, and then we have two more. The fourth one is the mardud. Al-mardud is the exact opposite of maqbool. It's the rejected one. Sometimes you look at a hadith, you look at the chain of narrators, it's an authentic chain. Reliable, narrating it from a reliable one, all the way to the Imam. But you see the scholars rejected this hadith. Shaykh al-Tusi does not accept it, Saduq does not accept it, Kulayni does not accept it. So you're like, wait a minute. These experts, they know the chain. They are the ones who gave us that chain. And it's an authentic chain, but none of them accepted it. They must have had a stronger piece of evidence that indicated this hadith is not reliable. Even if you have a solid chain. We call this mardud. Something that is rejected. So the mardud report is one that scholars have rejected it. Now why have they rejected it? Could be a discrepancy in the hadith. Could be some clues they had that we don't have and it did not reach us. Finally, we have a fifth type of hadith that is called al-mushtabah. What does al-mushtabah mean? The one that is suspect. Yes, let's call it the suspect. There's doubts about it. When you look at the circumstances of the hadith, the narrators who narrated it, it's a dubious hadith. You can't automatically discredit it and say, you know what, this hadith is false 100%. No. You just say, you know what, I don't know if this hadith is reliable or not. Let me look for other hadiths, other clues. I can't depend on this hadith. It's a dubious hadith. It was said in very dubious circumstances. There's something about it that, casts doubt on the hadith. So this is called a hadith that's mushtabah. And you can't issue a fatwa if you have a hadith like that. You need stronger evidence for you to issue a fatwa. So these are the 5 categories of the hadith that we have. وَصَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَى مُحَمَّدٍ وَآلِهِ الطَّاهِرِينَ.